Hi, Julia.
Hi, Eric.
Welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So, Julia, you have a new book.
I do.
Right. Friendly Fire, which we'll have convenient links for. And why don't you go over the argument that you make in the book?
Well, the book is called Friendly Fire. The subtitle is Losing Friends and Making Enemies in the Anti-American Century. And the book really sets out to ask one very basic question, which is how is it possible for one president and one war to so successfully galvanize global opinion against the United States? And, you know, one could make the case that all you need to do is publish a book of the photos at Abu Ghraib, the accounts of what transpires at Guantanamo, and a litany of the unilateralism of the diplomacy and the failures of the war in Iraq itself, and that would be enough of an answer. But,
right, so, yeah.
But I think that there are bigger issues going on than just this one guy and his war. So I wanted to really take a look at the rise of a very, very strong anti-American visceral sentiment among America's friends and allies, not among the fundamentalists, but among our historic friends and allies around the world, and kind of get my arms around what's really making that beat.
Right, because it's just, I mean, one of the things that interested me was that, just as you said, the easy answer could be, well, you have a president who, hey, is now widely disliked in his own country, right? Who you have started a war that's widely disliked within our own country. It's no big surprise. And so you make this argument, as you put it at one point in the book, that the sort of seeds of discontent were sown well before that.
Well, absolutely. Right. And I try to fashion a fairly bipartisan critique, although one party may get the lion's share at the end of the day. But the seeds of discontent sowed during the Cold War and after the Cold War, the alliance relations themselves that we established after World War II, after the Cold War, in places like South Korea, in Turkey, in Germany, even in the UK, countries which the United States helped to rebuild from rubble, where we created very expensive and long-lasting security frameworks, where we then supported eventually the transitions. And here I'm not talking about the UK, but I am talking about Germany, South Korea, and Turkey. Democracy. These are the countries, the very countries in which in the last few years, heads of state have come to office on anti-American tickets, and this has been surprising to Americans, to say the least. And so I really wanted to get at sort of how the very intimacy of our alliance relationships sowed the seeds of backlash, and not just with these larger countries, but really that during the Cold War itself, and especially in the absence of the Cold War, in the absence of the conflict with the Soviets, as the United States became the single superpower, many countries that historically had deferred to the United States, given us the benefit of the doubt, began to lose a reason to necessarily and viscerally defer to the United States. And after September 11th, and then especially with the war in Iraq, that sort of need for independence really became manifest.
And I mean, just to go back for a moment, one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of the kind of dynamic about how we in the U.S. talk about anti-Americanism, particularly on the sort of the liberal critique, is hey, look, it's no surprise Bush screwed up foreign policy. He's made a number of mistakes, and has really sort of added fuel to the fire in a significant way of anti-Americanism. And you sort of talk about not just sort of how obviously there was an undercurrent and a dynamic going on before Bush, but that there's a kind of I don't know if you refer to this as such, but a kind of collective amnesia on the part of the U.S., on the part of Americans, about the sort of role we've played in the world. People, I think a lot of liberal writers talk about the kind of grand old days during the Cold War.
I'm sorry, they talk about the bad old days?
No, the grand old days.
Oh, the grand old days.
Yeah, I mean about how
right.
Hey, before Bush, we were always promoting democracy, and we had such smart use of soft power, and
right.
et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on this, is that we're sort of spinning ourselves on that to a degree.
Well, yes, it's comfortable to believe our own rhetoric, drink our own Kool-Aid, and in the sort of understanding when the Cold War ended, and it was Democrats that were in office for most of the 1990s, remember, is that, but this was shared by both parties, that we won the Cold War, we were the last guys standing. That meant necessarily that our system, our model, our way of life must be the snazziest around, and it must mean also that all of these countries emerging from authoritarianism, whether in the developing world or in the former Soviet Union, necessarily wanted a piece of us and to buy into our model. And that sort of self-congratulatory ethos just permeated this town. I'm speaking from Washington, permeated among the political class, and I think really began to blind us to something absolutely critical, which is domestic politics, which are cultural dynamics, which is sort of just the very notion that the United States, and this goes back obviously to Woodrow Wilson and before, could reproduce our own model abroad, runs slam into the middle to the reality of other countries and sort of the preferences and conditions and histories that shape how people see themselves in the world. And especially in the 1990s, there was this notion that, we had Tony Lake talked about the strategy of enlargement, and Madeleine Albright talked about
what's the strategy of enlargement? Sorry.
A strategy of enlargement, that the notion was not only NATO enlargement, but strategic enlargement, sort of enlargement of our sphere. That's been a sort of strategic framework of the United States, extending the sphere since the Federalist Papers, and not only sort of the sphere in which we're influential, but in which our model is welcome. And that assumption that our model would be welcome was, I think, really distorted our assessment of our power and our capacity to get things done in the world. So especially, around democracy promotion that later is called regime change, that really we really confronted the stark reality of that in the last few years over Iraq, of course.
And I mean, one of the things is, and I've always been struck by this, is yes, we sort of promote democracies, but there's also, of course, this history where it's not simply hubris that everybody wants the wonderful democracies, system of democracy that we have. It's that sometimes we're indeed not promoting democracy apart from
well, right, of course, because the impression that we've given is that we promote democracy as long as our guys win. And sometimes democracy promotion is really about strengthening an opposition against, for example, in Latin America, against potential leaders from the left. Democracy promotion sounds really good, but it often means, or is accompanied by, and it was during the Cold War, the kind of dark side of the Cold War, the covert operations, the assassinations, the funding of right-wing militias, the dirty stuff that really has left a legacy, but that, interestingly, in the 1990s, had begun to get papered over, and I think there really was a kind of historic turning point in 1989 when much of the world did sort of, pick themselves up, look around, and listen to sort of this talk of globalization and democratization, and really saw those sort of that twin recipe as potentially very, very hopeful. And while not entirely putting aside history, ready to put aside history just by virtue of the fact that at the end of the day you got to feed your people and you got to sort of move forward.
You're talking about 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Is that what you're?
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm talking about the 1990s as a period of global transition where where there was just a palpable feeling that we're not fighting the Cold War anymore, and so there was opportunity. This was articulated by the United States, by the Clinton administration. Globalization would be the bridge to the 21st century, and together with democratization, open societies, those two would reinforce one another, and sort of this would be the bridge to the 21st century. But in fact, those two dynamics often have worked one against one another. And for the United States, where globalization became synonymous with Americanization, where globalization is perceived as a threat, as a failure, especially in its specific economic aspects, for example, in Latin America, this redounds negatively against the United States. You know, if we're selling a bill of goods that doesn't work, we're going to, in part, take the blame. And with democracy and open societies, well, you've got people with voice and vote that have never had that before, so they're voicing their discontent, and not only around sort of economic policies that the United States has advocated, the myopia of the Washington Consensus, for example, but also just with the kind of transparency of the world in which we live. U.S. behavior as the single superpower now, our unilateralism, what we do abroad, not necessarily even bilaterally with respect to one country or another, but generally, internationally, that is determines how we're perceived. I mean, it's very basic. What we do anywhere in the world is potentially a source of scrutiny everywhere in the world.
Let's just go back to a step to globalization and sort of unpack that a bit, because I think it's worth going over. When you sort of talk about the Washington Consensus, right, which Washington Consensus means a sort of liberalization of trade, kind of uber alles, more or less, right? That liberalization of trade is a sort of something of a cure-all, right? Was that
right.
Is that that's a fairly reductive, probably, version of the Washington Consensus. But
well, it's not only reducing subsidies and tariffs and trade liberalization. And by the way, trade liberalization not always in a reciprocal sense. I mean, one criticism of the American approach to trade is that we want others to open their markets, but of course we're deeply protectionist with respect to our own. But it's also privatization of state-owned companies. It's liberalization in the sense of weakening the state and allowing the market to be a lot more important, have a great deal more weight. And of course, you know, there's some really important aspects of macroeconomic stability that the Washington Consensus includes: keeping your fiscal house in order, keeping inflation down. But the specific aspect of it that has to do with weakening the state, we really saw kind of, I think, us throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And for developing countries where you need to have, as we've seen in Asia during the Cold War and subsequently, a public sector that functions, that can make the investments in human capital, in infrastructure, in nutrition, in the basic building blocks for competitiveness.
We also saw that in the U.S. development.
Well,
of
precisely,
the US.
and that's, you know, that goes back to this notion of what are the ingredients behind American success in the 20th century, and we've also forgotten as we kind of developed a kind of very narrow sense of what our free market model was, why it is that it succeeded. You know, it became a very ideological notion, and gone was the memory that we had made huge public sector investments by the state, that is, state investing in industry and infrastructure and education and all those things that we needed to succeed globally. And suddenly there was this kind of neoconservative critique of the state that infiltrated in, and by the 1990s it was shared by both parties. And so in our international policy and in our rhetoric vis-a-vis the third world, suddenly these public sector investments were just dismissed, and we forgot that was.
The era of big government is over. Rhetoric.
I missed that, Eric.
I'm saying the era of big government rhetoric,
yes,
which was
precisely.
sort of embraced by everybody. Okay, so it's all right. So that explains some of the seeds of discontent that were sort of sowed before the.
Oh, we're only on the seeds so far. Okay.
Right. We're still on the seeds. A little bit of globalization tossed in there, but we're still on the seeds. Right. Okay. So then you have one of our favorite presidents, I think, for both of us, George W. Bush, and who comes in and obviously makes a number of savvy moves, including invading Iraq. And
but don't forget, Eric, don't forget that before he invaded Iraq and before September 11th, he was withdrawing from Kyoto, from the ICC, pulling out of the ABM treaty, and generally letting the world know that he didn't really believe that we needed much from others in the world. So that was that was laying the groundwork, let's say.
Right. Well, actually, one of the things you point out is that you shouldn't get too narrowly focused on Iraq in terms of you point out, I think, in some public opinion polls that opinion of the U.S. started dipping before the invasion of Iraq.
Yes, it did. It started in 2002.
Right. So actually, some of that it could be said actually could be if it's 2002. You also have the invasion of Afghanistan, correct?
Well, sure. You do, but I'm not so sure that Afghanistan, had we stopped in Afghanistan, that the downward plummet of the polls would have continued. I think we really crossed a line when we moved our resources and did out of Afghanistan and to Iraq. Crossed the line in many ways, but in terms of global public opinion especially.
Right. So then, so in terms of the a couple of things, in terms of the effect of this sort of anti-Americanism, and really, I think what we're talking about, and we can get into this more, but isn't a lot of this sort of an anti-Bushism, by the way?
It is quite Bush-specific, and one of the things that's important about this book, the traditional, I just want to go back to one thing, the traditional kind of anti-Americanism that the United States has been the object of ever since our birth was very much based around sort of caricature and distortion and a sort of derision about the young and silly Americans, whether it's our bubblegum culture or our diplomatic naivete.
Right. Bush isn't the first cowboy who's been the first president who's been criticized as a cowboy.
No, actually, he's not. The others have, don't forget Ronald Reagan and LBJ.
Right.
Others have been criticized as cowboys. It has to do, though, the difference between this kind of the anti-Americanism of the olden days and this, what I call anti-America, is that this is not a kind of narrow bandwidth ideology. This is what I call anti-America. This is something that is visceral, and it crosses class and ideology and gender and race and politics and generations. And so it is no longer confined to the French left or the third world left or the nationalist right of different countries. It's very, very broad-based. And it's not just the ism anymore. That's one incredibly, I think, important point. But what Bush did is he kind of came along with his saunter and his swagger and the specific set of polarizing policies, and he just ripped off a Band-Aid that had been covering the kind of deeper structural dynamics of history we talked about, of globalization and its underbelly, and then also of the kind of dynamics of power and powerlessness, which would be present anyway, but which he has, I think, he and this administration have really exposed. And I don't know if I can talk about this now or you're going to get to it, but it's what I call the 80-20 divide.
No, let's talk about that 80-20 divide, because I think it's an interesting sort of, on the one hand obvious, on the other hand very underappreciated concept. So,
obvious and underappreciated. That's a good dynamic. No, but I'm happy to try to highlight it, and it came to me at a moment 4 years ago. I run a Latin America program, and I spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I was on my way to Venezuela 4 years into Hugo Chavez's tenure, and I sat down with a bunch of people that knew the country well and had spent time there, one of whom had been deployed to the U.S. Embassy from one of the intelligence agencies, and he had spent 4 years there, and I said to him, and I have also an interest in Cuba, and I knew that the Cubans were just starting to get involved in Venezuela, and I said, well, tell me about the extent of Cuban penetration in Venezuela. And he said to me, well, we have absolutely no idea, because we have no contact with the 80% of the Venezuelans that live in poverty, and that's where the Cubans are working.
Right,
and
so
that,
tendency to...
That just crystallized to me this kind of notion that increasingly, despite resources, technology, globalization, power, the United States, our political elite, professionals, government, private sector, media, sort of the overall political class, our elites, get our information about what makes other countries tick from a very narrow band of our peers, our interlocutors who we know how to talk to, who speak English, who tell us often what we want to hear, and whose class interests often are broadly coincident with ours, or if not class interests, other strategic interests. You saw this unfold. Just to go back to Venezuela for a minute, that was 4 years ago. It was just before the coup. We have now, instead of 2,000 Cubans in Venezuela, 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela, and a relationship that has totally deteriorated. Hugo Chavez, who's over whom we have almost zero leverage or influence, and this is right here in our hemisphere, a country which we still depend on for 14 or 15% of our oil. That is, it's a country which on the surface we ought to have deep ties with, but those ties, since at the end of the day were constructed only at the tippy top of society, now that we have this guy in power and we have a different kind of democracy happening there, we don't have access to.
Right. I mean, that kind of lack of kind of a depth of knowledge, right? Isn't it something that kind of rears its head? You're certainly right that it's a sort of tendency of Americans and of sort of American society, but we can come up with example after example of it having impacts, particularly in the last few years with this administration, right? I mean,
think about Chalabi and Iraq and his role.
That's what I was thinking of, and you also have in terms of Venezuela specifically, right? And
you have it in Venezuela, you have it in Bolivia, you have it even in a place like Mexico, where with NAFTA in our proximity, we ought to know and know better what's happening in Mexico than we seem to have. You could make the case that we have it almost everywhere in Latin America, and you could make the case, moreover, that we have it in a place like South Korea, or we have it all over the world. I can't think of a place where we don't have it. And this is not to say that obviously there are a great number of Americans who are different than this, but something happens once we get into power, whether it's in in private life or in public life, where this green zoning of American foreign policy and sensibilities just takes over.
Right, and let's just go over. I mean, it was a nice line, right? What you're referring to is the green zone in Iraq, right? Which is
where the American embassy compound is located, and where increasingly both journalists and all of the Americans that are involved trying to do, what little reconstruction we're now doing, and helping to keep the incredibly brittle Iraqi government propped up, and all it's the base. It's our base of operations in Baghdad, and it's protected by massive physical security that to prevent terrorist attacks and to protect the Americans. But that protection also is an enormous blinder. And I'm not saying that we should get rid of the green zone in Baghdad, but it is a great metaphor, I think, for the isolation that Americans, even those that are deployed around the world, experience.
Right. I don't know, by the way, this is on a slight tangent, but if you happen to read George Packer's recent piece on Iraq, one of the things he got into was the sort of insularity of U.S. forces in Iraq, and their the sort of general hesitance within the army to go out and work with Iraqis.
Well, you can hardly blame them.
What's that?
I mean, it's a dangerous place, but that
sure,
is,
it's a dangerous place. But if what you say is, I mean, and one of the officers was saying this is, it's also the only way that you can. It's also the only path toward sort of non-disaster, you might put it.
That's well said, and it is probably the case around the world that the benefits at the end of the day will far outweigh the risks toward moving beyond the concertina wire, getting out of the limo, getting outside of beyond those huge cement barriers on the other side of the thick glass. Probably the benefits will outweigh the risk. And, it's not only the physicality, the green zoning physically, it's also back to this who we talk to, when congressional delegations and executive branch delegations go around the world, they tend to allow the embassies on the ground to set up their visits who they talk to. Often that's ideologically driven, but it's also just kind of driven by laziness. And one of the things I propose is just throwing out the old Rolodexes and getting rid of the social secretaries that have been hooking Americans up with their interlocutors on the ground, and really breaking out and bringing in these new voices that are part of the democracies that we allegedly support, and new voices who don't necessarily tell us what we want to hear, who may profoundly object to what we're doing in the world, but from whom, if we don't hear from them, we will continue to reinforce the insularity abroad, and that will then sort of, I think, encourage the kind of insularity that's so thickly felt now in the American body politic at home.
All right, so let's get into actually, apart from sort of throwing out Rolodexes and going out and hanging out with the people, the things that can be done, right?
Wearing sandals and...
Right. So,
yeah.
right. Putting on your Tivas and going to hang out.
Yeah, no, but there's got to be something in between the sandalista thing and just,
By the way, for the record, in full disclosure, a sandalista in the early 80s, myself, I was in Nicaragua.
Well, we have something in common.
We can continue, okay. So, but
I was working with the Jesuits.
I'm not at liberty to say who I was working with.
Oh, okay. We'll do that offline.
That's right. We'll have that. We'll have that offline, and certainly not over the telephone. I
have nothing to hide.
Right. Okay. So, in terms of the things that can be done, right? I mean, there's. Let's take for a moment the public diplomacy, right?
I missed you there, Eric.
Public diplomacy.
Oh, yes. Let's take public diplomacy.
Let's talk about the wonders of public diplomacy.
Well, right now the state of public diplomacy is just cannot resist derision. And here's a great anecdote I'll tell you, just to describe how enormously counterproductive it is. Public diplomacy, in the olden days, it was a complement to a Cold War strategy that for all of the warts and problems that we've talked about, did actually succeed. But today, public diplomacy has sort of been embraced by President Bush with his appointment of Karen Hughes as this effort to explain ourselves. And the assumption is that we are confronting a world that's unhappy with us because we're just not understood. So that if we have a good face who's a good campaign spokesperson that can become a good foreign policy spokesman to explain ourselves, then that's going to solve the problem. And public diplomacy is rank propaganda if it doesn't have substantive policies that undergird it, that are seen broadly as credible and legitimate. And here's a good example of how abysmal the situation is right now. A couple of weeks ago, Condoleezza Rice took a trip to the United Kingdom, and it was that trip when she traveled around with Jack Straw and went to his hometown and essentially was shut down when she got there. She was received very, very hostilely, and it was a tough trip for her. And doing the advance work for that trip was one of Karen Hughes' deputies, who went over to the UK and gave some speeches and wrote a piece in The Guardian. And the headline of one of the speeches, and you know that in the United Kingdom, the issue of Guantanamo is really, really salient. There are British citizens there whom the UK has been trying to get released for some time, and just generally the conditions at Guantanamo are viewed as horrific, and it's a big human rights issue there.
Been into a number of plays, I believe, in London as well, right?
Yeah, so there's a play, and actually that play is running in the United States now, okay. Guantanamo, A Badge of Honor. Honor bound for freedom, excuse me.
Okay, so Karen Hughes' deputy.
Her deputy went over,
sorry, right.
And she gave a speech and wrote a piece that said, Guantanamo is not a spa, it's a humane prison. And just to sort of have I can only think of the Yiddish word, but to have the temerity to tell a breathing, thinking audience anywhere that Guantanamo is not a spa, and to think that that would be reassuring is such a preposterous notion of what public diplomacy is by this government that I really think that it's a waste of money. You know, it might put money into the communications and PR industry, but fundamentally it's a waste of money to even bother defending ourselves if that's how we're going to speak. Now, I don't. There's one part of public diplomacy that is incredibly important, that's also been vastly underfunded and underappreciated by this administration, but also beginning in the 1990s when we began to sort of shut down USIA, cut funds for cultural diplomacy and exchanges, and that is all of the kind of investments that we've made in area studies in the past, in training people in foreign languages, getting people out in the world, in paying for cultural diplomacy and people-to-people exchanges, bringing people here, sending Americans out. That those funds have absolutely atrophied, and those are incredibly important because they don't really, that kind of program doesn't really depend on what government policy is or isn't. It's something that can function independently, and it needs to be beefed up again. Right. I don't know actually anybody, even the public diplomacy experts that have who embrace it, that have anything positive to say about the public diplomacy efforts that are taking place right now. Although I'm going to say something positive right now, which is in Latin. No, let me say this. You know, Condi Rice and Karen Hughes went down to Latin America for the Chilean President Michelle Bachelet's inauguration, and then each of them went to several other countries. And while they were there, they substantially overhauled the rhetoric that they used. Instead of staying on this sort of high and out-of-tune note about trade and terror and drugs and security, they talked about social exclusion, they talked about poverty and inequality, they talked about social justice. And that makes a difference. I mean, in Latin America, you have nowhere to go but up in terms of where the United States stands. But to exactly recognize other countries define their interests differently than we defined ours was actually a start, and it went over well.
Right. So the question isn't the issue isn't that all public diplomacy is bad. It's just that bad public diplomacy is bad, right? It's like dunder-headed headlines and op-eds, and rather than really trying to even rhetorically, if you address people's concerns, it has that positive effect.
I think it can. Yeah. But you know, when you go to Turkey and you say, "I'm a mom who drives," and that's the way, as Karen Hughes did, that one thinks you're going to reach out to Turkish women. I don't know who she's listening to. I don't know where she's getting her advice, but it's facile and insulting.
In very small defense of Karen Hughes, I would only say that trip, that somewhat of a fiasco of a trip that you just mentioned to Turkey and other, happened a few months ago, and I have since sort of seen her making some smarter points, and particularly, apparently, there are more administration officials going on Al Jazeera nowadays, have got over their sort of juvenile anger toward Al Jazeera and are willing to sort of engage. And I would sort of suggest that, so long as you're willing to engage and actually sort of have a debate, there's a positive aspect to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, Condoleezza Rice has announced something called transformational diplomacy, which is about getting people out of the cushy jobs in the European capitals and sticking them out in the middle of the nowhere precisely to break down this green zoning. And, if it's done across the board, I think it's great. If it's done sort of in an ideological way to deal with potentially rogue countries, then, of course, you'll miss the point. Ultimately, you might satisfy a short-term need, but you might neglect another country that isn't today a problem to the United States but may become one in the future.
And then, of course, the sort of larger issue in terms of what you can do to kind of give ourselves a pick-me-up and be viewed a little bit better through the world is this sort of public diplomacy is really kind of a marginal thing, even if it is positive to some degree. It's around the edges. And the real issue is changing your policies.
Of course.
Right.
The real issue is policies, and it's also style, and it's also how we present ourselves. So put public diplomacy aside for a second. I think the United States is expected. We're the single superpower, and we're going to be the single superpower for a while. China will rise, but I think we're some time away from there being any constellation of forces that really can sort of absorb some of the global expectations and animus that by definition exist from countries without as much power as the powerful countries. So that means we have to be seen as providing global public goods. And think about all of the major global issues on the table today, whether it's proliferation or poverty and inequality or infectious disease or climate change or genocide. On all of those issues, we're expected to be providing global public goods. And what we're seen as doing is scaring the hell out of everybody, but as contributing to, because of Iraq and because of our general disposition to stay outside of convention, we're seen as contributing to inertia on almost all of those fronts.
Right.
So I think
part of the problem in terms of global warming and stopping any stopping any attempts to address it and so forth, right? That's what you're referring to.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, and not only stopping attempts to address it, but I'm also talking about this sort of notion that somehow the science isn't right, this kind of anti-scientism, there's specific things around the ICC, for example, where not only do we not want to be a member of the ICC, but we then punish other countries, allies, for refusing to sign exemptions, Article 98 exemptions, which would give American servicemen exemptions from prosecution, and the punishment is that we deny them military assistance. So sometimes it isn't only that we're sitting out of something like Kyoto, and I'm not saying that we necessarily have to get on board specifically with Kyoto to the letter, but it does mean that we have to come up with serious ways to redress this issue of carbon emissions. And likewise, back to the ICC, we deny military assistance to countries that are allies of ours, and then as a result we lose touch with their militaries, with their security forces, and create an enormous amount of animus and shoot ourselves in the foot. And even this administration has begun to acknowledge that.
Right. I was actually thinking of sort of looking for cases in which we've had a positive policy and whether and sort of seeing the effect of that. And I was thinking about the example of Lebanon.
Yeah.
Where we really sort of supported the Cedar Revolution, whatever you want to call it, and we seem to be on the sort of good guys side there. And I was looking at public opinion polling in Lebanon, which I do frequently, and I was noticing that it's one of the few places where opinion of the U.S. has picked up really solidly.
That's true. It has. And it's picked up not only in Lebanon, but it's picked up in places like Pakistan even, and Indonesia, where
Why
the United
Pakistan
States...
and Indonesia?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think it's picked up in Pakistan and Indonesia?
Well, there's some speculation that especially in Indonesia it's picked up because of the tsunami relief efforts that the United States was involved in.
Right. A big military effort, by the way, right? I mean,
that was a big military effort too. It was guys who usually have guns doing major humanitarian efforts. I mean, there was our aircraft carriers, our helicopters, but it was a gigantic humanitarian mission, and that's the same in Pakistan, where the U.S. military is involved in dealing with the consequences of the earthquake and that we had last winter. So.
Right.
This is although something that is widespread, I don't think it's something that needs to be permanent. But it does mean that you cannot do a tsunami relief every day. We couldn't even do a Katrina relief here in the United States. So to sustain the kind of bump and pulls that we got in those two countries, and in the case of Lebanon, in Lebanon we were seen as on the side of the good guys. And being seen to be on the side of the good guys isn't always something that the United States is gonna want to do, because that's not the nature of this country, and not the nature of sort of any country's national security or national interest. Sometimes we're going to be on the side of the bad guys. I'm not arguing that it's possible to always be on the good side of the good guys. Having said that, we have gone very far away, I think, from being associated with the kinds of ideals and values of democracy and human rights that are very much part of the American ethos. And so I think we need to make an effort to go back to that, even if the cost is that some of the people that come to be elected aren't necessarily pro-American, but may in fact be hostile to the United States.
Right. So I think am perhaps a little bit more on the woolly-headed side and have this very kind of idealistic vision that having a sort of more idealistic, human rights-oriented foreign policy, call me crazy, but could actually have an overall largely net positive effect. I'm actually reminded...
It depends what your goal is. I mean, if your goal is to be liked, sure, but not necessarily. It wouldn't get you to be liked by everybody. And I think it's really important that I mean, at least from my perspective, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm comfortable with ambivalence. My goal is not to suddenly be liked around the world. I don't think that's so important. But I do think you're correct that there's something deeply wrong with getting so far off the reservation that we are simply seen as hypocrites who don't take our own values seriously. And if you do have democracy and human rights as the core of your foreign policy, without discounting the use of military force, I think we can certainly get the United States on much better footing and still deal with the national security issues that face us today.
Right. I mean, I would just argue that the notion that I find appealing is that often, and not always, and this certainly doesn't mean any sort of, certainly doesn't rule out the notion of military force, but that often a sort of human rights-oriented or a sort of foreign policy that errs on the side of that more can certainly serve our national interest more than I think we often think it can. It gets sort of dismissed as, thinking of latte-sipping Brooklynites like me.
Well, right. I mean, it's seen as soft and mushy, and I think that the key point, maybe for the party that the two of us are associated with, even nominally, is that there is a mix of democracy and human rights, along with the willingness to use military force when necessary, that can, by and large, promote our national security and keep us secure. And also make it easier for our allies to be our allies. And that's a critical point, is that you've got this new, much more democratic international environment where governments that are our quote-unquote friends or allies are accountable first and foremost to their own electorates, to their own constituencies, and not to us. So if we want them to support us, to go out on a limb, to back the use of force somewhere, sometime, and that will happen in the future, we at a minimum need to have this core aspect of ourselves and who we are, this democratic commitment to human rights and equality, fundamentally, as being manifest. I think that would definitely help us, Eric.
So, in other words, having trust in the U.S. is having that is kind of a force multiplier, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we've lost the benefit of the doubt, and to get it back, I think we just have to go back to first principles. And yes, it would be a force multiplier.
Right. So, all right. So, I would just make a plug, actually, before we move on very briefly, that there was a Marine general who was head of the Pacific Forces for the Marines, who was talking about the kind of war on terrorism and the connection to our foreign policies, and particularly his argument was actually a very woolly-headed one, which is that it makes sense that we should more often than not be on the side of angels, is how he put it.
Be on the side of what?
Be on the side of angels. That's how he put it.
Ah. And, well, of course we should. But we won't always be, and since we won't always be, since we know we won't always be, we both know that, we have to at least by and large have a set of sort of commitments to these big sort of global fuzzy issues by and large that demonstrate to the world that all things being equal, we are still the good guys.
Right, sure. Okay, so let's change gears for just a moment and look at the kind of developments in Latin America.
Okay.
Right, where I think the way that it's sort of often put around here is, and here being the United States, is the kind of rise of the lefties is the storyline in Latin America. Right, so you have Chavez and Morales in Bolivia, and Castro's still sticking around.
Kirchner in Argentina.
Right.
And maybe Daniel Ortega reelected in Nicaragua.
Oh, yeah, right. So,
your friend.
So, but there's a degree to which that's again our kind of own myopic thinking, and it's really a great crude understanding of it, right? I mean,
right. Well, I don't think that we should shy away from talking about a kind of rainbow kind of left coming to power in Latin America. After all, that's what democracy generates, is dissent and diversity. I ran into a journalist who said to me, I see you at the Council on Foreign Relations are doing a panel on the left coming to power in Latin America. How can you say that? Almost as if that's a dirty word. But, in Latin America, in the United States, the left in Latin America has been a dirty word. Before Cuba, we had Arbenz in 1954 and the coup there, which was directed against a guy that was sort of a left-leaning social democrat who had communists in his cabinet. But then we had Castro come along, and for the entire Cold War, our policy toward Latin America was about preventing another Castro. And that meant all shades of gray were off the table. So whether it was Michael Manley in Jamaica or Salvador Allende in Chile, you had the United States explicitly going after the left and supporting regimes that kept the left out of power, and often in a very repressive and oppressive way. And then, of course, in Central America, that's where, of course, regime change and rollback was born, where we waged a significant counterinsurgency against the Salvadoran left and brought down a government in Nicaragua. So that's the record for Latin America. But today, what you have is democratically elected governments. You have everything from a Michelle Bachelet in Chile, who, if she were stuck in Europe, would be practically a Christian Democrat in terms of her centrism and her moderation. And you have Hugo Chavez, who is an authoritarian military guy, who's a populist in the sense that he's not interested in building democratic institutions. He's interested, for lots of different reasons, in taking all that money he has and distributing it around, not only to the 80% that have never had benefited from the oil wealth there, but outside of his country too. You've got a sort of tough-talking anti-American left in Evo Morales, but of course Morales is very much the product of America's counter-drug policy. And so you have a diversity. You have Lula, I can't forget him, in Brazil, which is a left party, the PT, the Workers' Party, that's been around for 20, 30 years, that has long experience in government, that comes from originally a very ideological left, but now in power is governing with continuity in terms of economic policy, and actually has managed a really decent relationship with the United States. So it's a very diverse picture, and it's the first time, I think, since the Cold War ends, that the United States is challenged to put its money where its mouth is and show that it can tolerate dissent within this hemisphere. And actually, in the second term of the Bush administration, there are positive signs in that direction, Eric.
Let's go over those signs very briefly. I mean, what are some examples of those signs?
Well, it started with Brazil in the first term for a certain set of reasons, I think, having to do with the size of the Brazilian economy and the signaling that Lula sent during his campaign in terms of Wall Street and keeping the fiscal house in order and a particular budget surplus, and continuing the macroeconomic policies of Cardoso. This administration, both terms, has really built, and to the credit of our first ambassador there, Donna Reinach, she opened up the embassy. She busted down that 80-20 barrier. She really reached out to the new cast of characters that was coming into Brazil's public life early on, and it has really, really paid off.
And in terms of our reaction in Bolivia,
but I'm sorry, I can't hear you. But let me just keep going a little bit.
In terms of Bolivia and Venezuela,
right?
What's our sort of stance toward both those guys right
now?
Well,
our in the first term we had a lot of people that had fought the Cold War from the office of Jesse Helms or the Reagan administration, running Latin America policy, and they focused a lot on Chavez, Castro, and Aristide. Very ideological. Not a lot else on the table. What we've seen now in Venezuela is an effort in the second term to avoid getting sucked into the kind of provocative, hostile rhetoric that Chavez really seems to thrive on, and an effort to I guess you could call it containment. They haven't articulated it as that, but they're really trying to ratchet down the tension bilaterally, and I think recognize that we have left an enormous policy vacuum within the region, especially in the Andean region. So Chavez is being dealt with sort of as a case apart. In Bolivia, there's a very strong recognition that after hundreds of years of political exclusion of the majority and ethnic majorities in that country, this is a moment when Bolivian democracy and social movements are having their day, and there's not a lot the United States can do to stop that from happening. And there's a recognition that that our counter-drug policy has helped polarize Bolivian politics and had the effect of creating somebody and building a power base for Evo Morales, who comes out of the coca-growing farmers movement. So there's a recognition now that, with a kind of enormous mandate, he's got the biggest mandate of any Bolivian elected since 1982 when authoritarian rule ended, 54%. There was no second round runoff, that we have to demonstrate our democratic bona fides, which we appeared not to when we appeared to support the coup in 2002 in Venezuela. So in Bolivia, we are very much on notice that we have to sort of bend over backwards to accommodate this guy and recognize the domestic politics that he's facing. And I think that this team of people that's running Latin America policy is making an effort to do that, but they are deeply constrained by our own domestic politics, especially on the drug front. And rather than go to Congress and say, look, this drug policy is a failure and we need to completely overhaul it because it is putting us in an untenable situation with this country called Bolivia, and not only in Bolivia but elsewhere too, for example, Peru. What we're doing instead is saying, well, we can try to work with the Bolivians to refashion a counter-drug policy, but we're constrained by Congress, and so our hands are tied. So in the case of Latin America and Bolivia, just to stay there for a second, we really are constrained by domestic politics. And you can say that across the board, on trade, on immigration, on drug policy. Our domestic politics in this country really drive and constrain specific policies toward Latin America. But I'm seeing us begin to rise above the ideological knee-jerk response that we've had historically to the left. Even though if you look at the media, you just see the leftward lurch, the leftward lurch. I do think there's some smart people trying to get beyond that.
Which sort of raises the issue that to some degree the administration has learned some lessons about not to be too condescending about it, but has been smarter about its rhetoric, has been smarter about the kind of tough.
Yeah, they're getting smarter. I mean, in a way, the bigger the country and the farther, or at least the farther away from it is from us physically, we seem to be smarter. Because here I'm thinking of Nicaragua, where, I don't know anybody that looks forward to having Daniel Ortega in office again, and I think the embassy down in Managua has been pretty explicit about our hope that the Nicaraguan people would not elect Daniel Ortega. And, that kind of thing, as anathema as he may be and as, authoritarian as he has become, not a Democrat at all, it will just backfire if again we are seen to be trying to throw an election. So the picture isn't perfect, but it's definitely improved, and some lessons have been learned.
Your arguing is that the sort of bigger the country, the more it's on the radar, the less we'd sort of screw with it in that way, the smarter we'll be.
Seems to be the case. And Bolivia is also far away, and that helps too. It's not a big country. Well, it's actually quite big, but it's also farther away than the smaller Central American countries.
Right. And in terms of the other sort of potential silver linings that we have here, right?
Right.
One of the visions being that we can become so sort of disliked that it becomes very evident to the U.S. and then there becomes a sort of kind of a certain humility, right? That ends up coming out of it.
Eric, the connection is not so good right now, so I heard almost none of that last question.
Okay. I'm talking about the notion of
That's better.
Of the sort of silver linings, right, that could come from all the bad polling of U.S. opinion of the U.S. abroad.
Well, there is a silver lining. One is there's already a process of recognition taking place. When I started writing this book, 2.5, 3, well, I began thinking about it in 2002, 2003. The mood in the country was very, very different, and I thought that what I had to say would be met with a lot of skepticism. But the mood in the country has changed a lot. Americans, and you see this in polls, and you see this in our debate about Iraq, and more broadly about sort of how we use our power in the world, our Americans are very cognizant that the bottom has fallen out and are unhappy with that, and are fully cognizant that sometimes less is more when it comes to power, and that giving up, conceding pieces of our interests in order to fashion consensus positions on these big issues is going to be absolutely critical. So that's changed. The other thing is that I think it has exposed a process that was already underway but that we weren't so ready to recognize, which is, although we're the single superpower now, our power is in a way declining just because the power of others is rising, and there are new big global players, not as big and global as us, but significant to deal with, that we are starting to see as potential allies, and I think that's a good thing. Here I'm thinking about India, I'm thinking about Brazil, I'm thinking about South Africa. It's not always a pretty picture with any of these countries, but they're emerging on the world stage, and we're beginning to recognize that as something positive. Also, this kind of declaration of political, diplomatic, and policy independence that's coming out of so many different countries in the world, frankly, I think that's a good thing, because I think, on the one hand, the United States needs to make an effort to demonstrate that being the single superpower is something that others in the world ought to welcome. But on the other hand, seeing that there are others in the world that can sort of share some of the pain is probably a good thing for the American people. I want to say something about the immigration debate at home,
right,
which is that I was, along with the Dubai ports issue and sort of the response of both political parties to that, I was very horrified at the xenophobia and the insularity that both our immigration debate initially and the response to the Dubai ports issue demonstrated. Of course, the process of the Dubai ports review was flawed, and the president should have known about it, but this was an opportunity for our leaders, the elected officials, to get up and say to the American people, we are, as a country, a better society because, and who we are is we've always had capital coming in from other countries. We've never been just this kind of, insular, isolated block that our elected officials allowed the Americans to think that we'd been. Same on people. We've always been a country that has been made up of people coming from elsewhere. And when the immigration debate began to turn, and it turned as a result of all of those people getting into the streets, that was an incredibly beautiful moment where the kind of upside of who we are as a society, our capacity to have massive peaceful demonstrations, a new civil rights movement come out, that kind of, I think, punched through globally, and you could read some of the foreign coverage, and people were really happy to see that the response of building the wall wasn't necessarily, and law enforcement and just throwing people out of this country wasn't necessarily going to be accepted by Americans, and so that sort of helped, I think, punch through some of the isolation and the xenophobia that in a way has been part of the American reaction to the downward turn of global views toward the United States. So I think we are at a turning point now, and a very good one, but it's not clear which way it's going to go yet.
Okay, well, on that fairly optimistic note, I think we can wrap it up.
All right, Eric. Well, thanks for talking today.
And thanks for coming on to Blogging Heads TV.
I will be happy to come back anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.